All right, welcome back, everyone. This week in lab, we're going to go over joints, movements, and muscles. There's a lot of stuff to cover this week, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. So, in this first week of lab, we will be able to name and describe the three functional categories of joints, name and describe these three structural categories of joints. Yeah, okay, hold on, listen twice. Identify the types of synovial joints, define origin and insertion of muscles, and demonstrate or describe various body movements. All right, so first is joint classifications. When looking at joint classifications, we're looking at two main things, their structure and their function. When we look at structure, we look to see what kind of tissue connects the bones together and whether or not there is a joint capsule. Fibrous joints are going to have a fibrous connective tissue joining the bones, such as dense, regular connective tissue, like a ligament. Cartilaginous joints will have a cartilage holding the bones together, and a synovial joint will have a synovial cavity and will be surrounded by an articular capsule. For function, remember the acronym SAD. That stands for synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. Synarthrosis joints are immovable joints such as sutures on the skull. Amphiarthrosis joints are slightly movable joints, and diarthrosis joints are what you think of typically with the joint is freely movable and can move in multiple directions. So this table shows you how we classify joints based on structure and function, as well as a couple of examples of each. So again, first we have fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are characterized by adjoining bones by dense regular connective tissue, mainly ligaments, and they do not have a joint cavity. The three main types of fibrous joints are sutures, which are made up of short fibers, syndesmosis, which is made up of long fibers, and gomphosis, which is a special type of ligament attaching the teeth to the skull. Next, we have cartilaginous joints. These are characterized by connecting bones with cartilage and again, not having a joint capsule or a joint cavity. The structured types of cartilaginous joints are synchondrosis, which is comprised of hyaline cartilage, and the symphysis, which is comprised of fibrocartilage. And then finally, we have synovial joints. Synovial joints are characterized by being covered in articular cartilage. They're separated by a joint cavity and are surrounded by the articular capsule that is lined within the synovial membrane. Synovial joints are diarthrotic, meaning they are freely movable. Um, so this is a visual representation of the different type of joints. On the left here, we have three examples of our cartilaginous joints. We have hyaline cartilage here in between the sternum and the rib. You have fibrocartilage in between the vertebrae. And then lastly, we have fibrocartilage here in the pubis, which makes your pubic symphysis. At the top, we have an example of a fibrous joint where a fibrous joint where the sutures of the skull are connected. And at the bottom, we have another fibrous joint where the fibula and tibia are being connected by dense regular connective tissue. Note that fibrocartilage and fibrous joints are not the same. Fibrocartilage is a type of cartilage, so it falls in the cartilaginous group. On the right side, we see our synovial joints. The humerus and scapula join to form a multi-axial ball and socket synovial joint. It is multi-axial because it can move in many different directions. Next, we have the elbow joint, which is a uniaxial joint. Uniaxial meaning it can only go in one plane direction. For the elbow, that is flexion and extension. And then finally, we have the wrist joint, which is a biaxial joint. It's biaxial because it can move in two plane directions. That's flexion and extension and lateral flexion and extension. So here we have an image of a synovial joint. You can see the synovial cavity contains synovial fluid that's going to be secreted by the synovial membrane. The bone, synovial cavity, synovial fluid, and synovial membrane are all going to be held together by the articular capsule. The articular capsule is made up of two layers. The inner layer is made up of the synovial membrane, and the outer layer is made up of a fibrous connective tissue. You can also see the articular cartilage at the ends of the long bones to help reduce friction, and there are some ligaments here connecting the bones together to add even more stability. All right, so there are different types of the freely movable synovial joints. So a plain joint here in top left is a gliding joint, meaning it does not pivot. It glides across the surface of the other bone. And is found in the where your vertebrae articulate and within the wrist. Next, we have our hinge joint. You can find these in your elbow and then the joints of your fingers. They move in one axis and they can only do flexion and extension. Then we have our pivot joint, which you'll find in the radial ulnar joint and the atlantoaxial joint, which is the one in your skull with the atlas and the axis vertebrae. Again, these are also only on one axis and they do rotation. Next, we have our condylar joint. These will be found in between the metacarpal and phalangeal joints and your radiocarpal joints. These are biaxial, so they move in two axi. They have flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. We'll go over what those two are in a little bit. Next, we have our saddle joint. You can find this where your thumb is, your carpal and metacarpal joint. It is also a two-axis joint or biaxial. And again, it does flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. And lastly, we have the ball and socket joint. This is what your hip and your shoulder are. They are multi-axial and they can do flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation. And here's just another table showing you the characteristics of each synovial joint type. So here is an image showing you how muscles attach to bone to allow for movement. Each muscle has an origin point and insertion point. The origin is anchored and does not move. The insertion point is where the muscle will pull on the bone and bring it towards the point of origin. This is an example of the brachialis muscle contracting and pulling on the bone of the forearm to help flex the elbow. So now we're going to look at the different actions of muscles and joints, and we will start with the head and work our way down. So when we bend our head forward, that is flexion. Whenever you hear flexion, think of the angle of the joint decreasing. Neck extension is normally what we are in when we're in anatomical position. So just looking straight ahead and like a normal posture. And hyperextension is when you extend past that anatomical position and trying to look up and you bend your head back. And similar for the trunk of the body, when you are standing upright, you're in extension. When you bend forward, you're flexing the trunk. And when you bend backwards, you're hyperextending the trunk. Okay, so at the top, we see knee flexion and knee extension. Flexion being bending the knee and bringing the lower leg back behind you, and extension being the straightening of the leg. We also see shoulder flexion and extension. Shoulder flexion is raising the arm up in front of you, and extension is going to bring the arm down and behind you. On the bottom, we see shoulder abduction and adduction. Abduction is bringing the shoulder away from the body. Adduction, you are bringing the arm towards the body. People get these confused pretty often. An easy way to remember them is to think adduction, you're adding the arm back to the body. You will also hear me say abduction for abduction, just to make sure it's clear which direction I'm talking about. So abduction or abduction is away from the midline. You also have circumduction on the shoulder, which allows the arm to move freely in a circle pattern. And then next we have neck rotation, which is turning your head from left to right. And remember, that's only allowed because of the special characteristics of the first two vertebrae. And then finally, we have lateral or external rotation and medial or internal rotation of the hip. Lateral rotation is going to have the knee and foot pointed away from the midline of the body. Medial rotation is going to see the knee and foot pointed inwards towards the midline of the body. And again, so lateral rotation is also known as external rotation, and medial rotation is also known as internal rotation. So next we have pronation and supination of the forearm. So in an anatomical position with the palm of the hand facing forward, the forearm is in a supinated position. In this position, the radius and ulna are laying parallel next to each other. When we turn our hand over so the palm is facing behind you, this is the pronated position. When pronated, the radius is going to rotate over across the ulna. The way I remember this is just think about holding soup in my hand. So if I were to try to pour soup into your hand, you would put your arm into the supinated or into supinated position or supination and make a cup with your hand. So that position is supination. Next is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion of the ankle. Dorsiflexion is bending the ankle and bringing the toes up towards the shin. Plantar flexion is pushing the toes and ankles down, like you were trying to push on a gas pedal. And then lastly, we have inversion and eversion. Inversion is going to be rolling your ankle over toward the pinky side of the foot, and eversion is going to be rolling your ankle toward the big toe side of the foot. Okay, so this is a diagram of the knee joint from a lateral view. The knee is a very complex structure, so I would do my best to walk you through it. So we already know that the bones of the knee are the femur, the tibia, and the patella. Within the knee, we have our articular capsule on the posterior side and several bursa on the anterior side. Bursa are sacs of synovial fluid that are used to help cushion against impacts. There are also several tendons and ligaments found within the knee. We have the quad tendon that attaches the quad muscles to the patella. The patella is then connected to the tibia by the patellar ligament. You may have heard the patellar ligament also be known or called the patella tendon. However, that's not really true because ligaments connect bone to bone, not tendon. So patella is a bone connecting to the tibia, another bone, so it's a ligament. Tendons connect muscles to bones. And then within the joint cavity of the knee, there are two more ligaments we see in this image. We have the posterior cruciate ligament, or your PCL, and the anterior cruciate ligament, or your ACL. The job of these two ligaments is to prevent the femur from sliding anteriorly or posteriorly within the joint. Also within the joint, we have our lateral and medial menisci, or the meniscus, the lateral and medial menisci. And the meniscus is made up of cartilage to help absorb shock between the femur and tibia, and also help reduce friction. So here is an anterior view of the knee. Again, we can see the ACL and PCL in the middle of the joint, and our menisci sitting in between the femur and tibia. In this view, we can also see the last two ligaments of the knee. That's the fibular collateral ligament, also known as the lateral collateral ligament, or your LCL, and the tibial collateral ligament, also called the medial collateral ligament or the PCL. The tibial collateral ligament attaches the medial condyle of the femur to the tibia on the medial side of the knee. But here is a good image of the quad muscles and superficial ligaments around the knee joint. There are two more structures we have not seen yet. Those are the lateral and medial patellar retinaculums. These just help add additional support and stability to the knee joint. And then this is a image of a knee cadaver. You can see the ACL and PCL and the medial and lateral menisci. you can also see that LCL and MCL in there as well. So here's an image of the ligaments and tendons on the posterior side of the knee. And some of the structures have been cut so you can see all the different layers of ligaments. At the deepest level, we see the articular capsule being covered by the network of supporting tendons and ligaments that run on top of it. You have the oblique popliteal ligament and the arcuate popliteal ligament, which are both named after the popliteal muscle that they run over, which is right here. And then you can see the medial and lateral head of the gastrocnemius, which is your calf muscle, which helps aid in knee flexion. And then we also see the tendon of the adductor magnus here, which is going to assist in adduction of the femur and hip. So add ADD duction. And then the last tendon we see is the tegment of the semimembranosus down here, which is a muscle in the hamstring group and also assists with knee flexion. Then here is another cadaver image of the shoulder. You can see that joint cavity here in the middle, right between the head of the humerus and that glenoid fossa of the scapula. So the shoulder is another complex joint, so bear with me. The shoulder is very mobile, but very unstable. So there are lots of ligaments and muscles and tendons that aid in increasing the stability of the joint. So the shoulder joint also has an articular capsule, but unlike the knee, the articular capsule of the shoulder does cover the entire joint. See the glenohumeral ligaments here layer on top of each other, but there's multiple of them, and help hold the humerus on the anterior side of the joint. And then the glenoid labrum here in the middle surrounds the glenoid cavity to help hold in the head of the humerus in place. And then here's just another cadaver image of the shoulder that highlights the rotator cuff muscles. We won't really go too deep into those in lab, but that's where they are. All right, so this image shows the other ligaments that help aid stability of the shoulder. You have your coracoacromial ligament here attaching the acromion region and the coracoid process of the scapula. And right below that, you have another bursa called the subacromial bursa. Next, we have our coracohumeral ligament that connects the head of the humerus to the coracoid process of the scapula. And beneath that, we have our transverse humeral ligament that crosses over the tendon sheath of the biceps brachii tendon. Think of the tendon sheath as another layer of cushioning similar to a bursa. And then lastly, we have the subscapularis tendon here, which is another muscle found in the rotator cuff. And beneath that, we have our subscapular bursa. All right, so for the shoulder model, make sure you can identify the articular capsule, the coracoacromial ligament, the coracoclavicular ligament, the acromioclavicular ligament, the coracohumeral ligament, and then, of course, the humerus, the clavicle, and the scapula. So next, in exercise 12, we're going to go over the structures of a muscle fiber. So this is a microscope slide of a skeletal muscle tissue. You can see the striations that are caused by dark A and light I bands that are made up of different types of proteins. We'll talk about here in a second. So this slide breaks down the layers of skeletal muscle and its connective tissues. On the left, we can see the tendon coming from the main muscle connecting to a bone. Coming off that tendon, moving towards the right, is a thick layer of connective tissue called the epimysium. The epimysium covers the entire muscle. Within the epimysium are individual bundles called fascicles. Fascicles have their own covering called the perimysium. And then within the fascicle is another layer of connective tissue called the endomysium. The endomysium contains bundles of individual muscle fibers. And then within each muscle fiber are tiny structures called myofibrils. So for this, remember large to small. The largest layer is the epimysium. Within the epimysium are fascicles that are surrounded by the perimysium. Within the fascicle are muscle fibers surrounded by an endomysium, and within the muscle fiber are myofibrils. So this breaks down the composition of a muscle fiber. Bundling the muscle fiber together, we have a sarcolemma. Also within the sarcolemma, we have our mitochondria and our nuclei. So this slide shows the composition of a single myofibril. We see our A band here and our I band that are responsible for the striations of the muscle tissue. The bands are made out of two different types of proteins known as filaments. The I band only contains actin, which is the thin filament, and the A band contains actin and myosin, which is the thick filament. So actin, thin filament, myosin, thick filament. Within the I band, you have a zigzag structure known as a Z disc, which are made up of only actin. The area between two Z discs is known as the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the contractile unit of the muscle. Be sure to remember that actin is the thin filament and myosin is the thick filament because that is very important. So then this image here is, in my opinion, one of the most important slides when talking about the structure of muscle tissue. So this image shows the structure of a sarcomere within a myofibril. The sarcomere, again, is the contractile unit of the muscle. This is what allows muscles to shorten and stretch, and in turn is what is responsible for movement. Here you can see the heads of the myosin, and during contraction, the heads of the myosin will grab onto the actin and pull on it, causing them to slide over the myosin and move closer to the M line, which is the center of the sarcomere. This phenomenon is known as the sliding filament theory. Also in this slide, we can see the third filament type, which is titin, which are elastic fibers, which gives muscle their stretching capability. Do know this slide pretty well. You will probably see this again. You will definitely need to know about this and the sliding filament theory for your lecture part of this class. So then here is another histology slide of muscle tissue where you can see the different coverings within the muscle. We have the epimysium covering the entire muscle, the perimysium separating the different fascicles, and the endomysium surrounding the individual muscle fibers. So this is another extremely important image when talking about muscle structure and function. So this image depicts the neuromuscular junction and depolarization of the sarcolemma, which causes excitation of the muscle. The yellow structure at the top is the axon terminal or of a motor neuron. A neuron is just a fancy term for a nerve. Each axon terminal integrates with the sarcolemma of a muscle fiber. When an electrical signal comes from the brain telling a muscle to contract, the axon terminal will release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine into the gap junction or the synaptic cleft of the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine, which are the little green dots here, will bind to a acetylcholine receptor embedded into the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. When that happens, when acetylcholine receptors recognize the presence of acetylcholine, an electrical charge is generated across the sarcolemma, causing a depolarization, which will then lead to muscle contraction. We won't get into the mechanism of muscle contraction in lab. That is more for lecture, but I am really familiar with this. So if you do need help with that at any point, let me know and I can kind of walk you through that. Okay, so next we're going to start actually talking about muscles. So we're gonna go over some specific muscles, their origins, search-ins. We'll also talk about how muscles are named and the different roles in movement. So first are the types of skeletal muscle. So we have agonists, which are prime movers, and these are the muscles most responsible for producing a particular movement. An example is your bicep is the agonist for your elbow flexion. So if we do a bicep curl, that is the agonist. The antagonist is the muscle that opposes or reverses a movement. So again, with that bicep curl example, your agonist is your bicep, your antagonist would be your tricep on the back. Synergists are muscles that aid in the action of the agonist, which either by assisting the same movement or by reducing any unnecessary movement. So an example again for this, sticking with that bicep curl, your bicep is the prime mover or the agonist. A synergist would be your brachialis, which is a smaller muscle that also attaches to the forearm. And then lastly, we have fixators, which are specialized synergists that immobilize the origin of a prime mover. They help maintain posture and help stabilize the scapula during arm movements. Then now we'll go over how muscles are named. So muscles are named in a few ways. One based on the direction of the muscle, which is usually in reference to the midline and based on the arrangement of the fascicles. So rectus muscles are straight up and down. Transverse muscles are perpendicular to the midline, so they run across. And oblique muscles are at an angle to the midline, so they kind of run at an angle to the midline. Yeah. And then next we have relative size of the muscle. So maximus is going to be a very large muscle. Minimus is going to be the smaller muscle. Longus is going to mean it's a longer muscle, and brevis is a shorter muscle. Next, we have the location of the muscle. So some muscles are named for the bone which they're associated with. Example of that is your temporalis muscle is over your temporal bone. Next, we have the number of origins. So a bi muscle has 2 origins, a tri muscle has 3 origins, and a quad muscle has 4 origins. So bicep, there are 2 um, origin heads of the bicep. Your tricep has 3 origin heads, and your quadriceps have 4. And then next, we have location of the muscle's origin and insertion. For example of that is the sternocleidomastoid muscle has an origin on the sternum and clavicle and inserts on the mastoid process. So sternal, cleidoid is your sternum and clavicle, and then mastoid is your mastoid process. So keep continuing on with that. We have the shape of the muscle. So deltoid is going to be a triangular shaped muscle. Trapezius is a trapezoid shaped muscle. Serrated muscles are raised like the edge of a serrated knife, and a rhomboid muscle is like a diamond shape. And then lastly, we have the action of the muscle. So for the adductor muscles, they are going to aid in adduction of the inner thigh. So your adductor longus, your adductor magnus are going to be adductor muscles of the thigh. The adductor longus is going to be a longer one, and the adductor magnus is going to be a larger muscle. And then within each muscle, fascicles can have multiple shapes. So circular muscles are going to be found around the mouth and eyes. Convergent muscles are going to have muscles that originate from different parts and then all come together in one area, like your pec muscle. Fusiforms will have multiple heads that will then join in their muscle belly. Parallel muscles will have fibers that run along next to each other in a parallel fashion. And then pinnate muscle refers to the angle of the fibers within the muscle. You can have multiple angles or be multi-pinnate. You can have 2 angles or be bipinnate, or you can have 1 angle and be unipinnate. So the easiest way to go through the muscles to separate them by region. So we'll go through the head, face, and neck first. Then we go to the torso, arm, and then we'll end with the leg. Okay, so the muscles of the face, head, and neck are epicranius, that has two bellies. There's the frontal belly or the frontalis, and the occipital belly, which is also the occipitalis. Then we have our temporalis muscle, our orbicularis tori, or orbicularis oculi, which is around our eyes. The zygomaticus major and minor, which are like our cheekbones, our smile bones. The masseter is like our jaw, the muscle in our jaw. The orbicularis oris is the one around your mouth. The platysma is a really large superficial muscle in the neck. And the sternocleidomastoid mastoid is again a muscle in the neck. So here we can see the temporalis muscle here on the temporal bone. We have our epicranial muscle on the frontal belly or the frontalis here. We have the orbicularis oculi around your eyes. We have the zygomaticus major and minor here on the cheek. On the side of the face where our jaw is, we have our masseter muscle. Down here, you can see our platysma, which is this wide, large sheath of muscle here in the neck. And then deep to the platysma, we have our sternocleidomastoid here, which originates again on the sternum and clavicle, and then inserts here on the mastoid process. Here is a lateral view of the face. So you can again see that temporalis muscle here on the temporal bone, the masseter muscle here in the jaw, and then we can also see our buccinator muscle here in the mouth. And here again is another image of the face. We can finally see our occipital belly of our epicranius muscle or the occipitalis. Again, you have our temporalis muscle here, the zygomaticus major and minor here, the buccinator deep in here, the orbicularis ori here, the orbicularis oculi here on the eye, and then the platysma here again, and then deep to the platysma is the sternocleidomastoid. And then this is a cadaver image of the muscles in the face. All right, next we'll move on to the muscles of the torso. First, we go over the anterior side. So we'll go over the chest, that's your pec major and pec minor, your intercostal muscles, which are in your ribs, and your serratus anterior, which is also in the rib region. And then a little bit further down, we'll go over the abdomen. So we have our external and internal obliques, which are the muscles kind of on the side of our abdomen. We have our rectus abdominis, which is the muscle you think of when you think of abs. And then beneath that, we have our transverse abdominis muscle there. So in the chest region, we have again our pec major, our pec minor here. We have our intercostal muscles in between each rib, and then attached to the rib that are the serratus anterior muscles. And then here in the abdomen, we have our rectus abdominis here, which is one of the superficial muscles. Deep to the rectus abdominis, we have our transverse abdominis here. Then we have our external oblique, which is a superficial muscle. And then deep to that, we have our internal oblique here. They note that they're oblique because the fibers run in that angled fashion compared to the midline. And then here is a cadaver image again of the abdomen muscles in the chest. So you can see the serratus anterior here on the side of the ribs, deep to that pectoralis muscle. We have our rectus abdominis here again, superficial. You can see our transverse abdominis running across our stomach here, underneath the rectus abdominis. We have our internal oblique here running this way, and then our external obliques here running this way. All right, so next we go to the muscles of the back. So we have our trapezius, the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and subscapularis, which are all around the shoulder. We have our teres major and teres minor. We have our rhomboid major and our latissimus dorsi. All right, so the trapezius muscle is the biggest one in the back that you usually see. It's really superficial, and it looks like that chapulate shape here. The latissimus dorsi are the lower back muscles that are also superficial here. We have our teres major here, the infraspinatus here. You cannot see the subscapularis and the teres minor here because they're a little bit deeper. So we go to the next image. So then here we can finally see that infraspinatus and the teres minor here and the rhomboid major here. And the supraspinatus is here on top of the shoulder. And again, we see on the left, we have our latissimus dorsi and trapezius, which are going to be our superficial muscles of the back. And then here you can kind of see better in the shoulder region. We have our supraspinatus here and the kind of top of the scapula, the infraspinatus across the back, the teres minor deep to the infraspinatus and teres major, which is down here. And then again, we have our latissimus dorsi here. And now we'll go over the muscles of the arm. So we have our deltoid, which is the main shoulder muscle, the coracobrachialis, the biceps brachii, the triceps brachii, the inochius, and the forearm group. But we do not need to know the individual muscles of the forearm. So here we see that deltoid muscle here on the cap of the shoulder. We see our biceps brachii, which is the two-headed main muscle in the upper arm, responsible for elbow flexion. And we can also see the triceps brachii picking out around from the back of the humerus around the bicep here. And we go to the next slide. Again, we see that biceps brachii here. We can see that coracobrachialis here, which is going to be deep to the biceps brachii. And then finally, we have the muscles of the forearm, but you do not need to know the individual ones. So you do not need to know pronator teres, brachioradialis, all those. And again, here's the back of the forearm. You do not need to know these. Okay, so now we'll go over the muscles of the leg. So we have our tentor fasciae latae, the sartorius, the gracilis, your iliopsoas, the pectineus, our adductor group, which are the adductor longus, adductor brevis, adductor magnus, the quadricep group, which is on the anterior side of the leg, so your quads. You have your vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, the vastus intermedius, and the rectus femoris. And then we have our hamstring group, the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris. And then lastly, we have the muscles of the hip, which are our glute muscles, the glute max and glute med. So the superficial quad muscles we see here are the vastus lateralis here, the rectus femoris here, and you can kind of see the vastus medialis here. You can also see the sartorius, the longer muscle here, the tentor fascia latae here, your TFL muscle. And then in the adductor group, we have our adductor longus and our adductor magnus. There's also the gracilis here on the inside of the leg. And then back up top, we have our iliopsoases. They have 2 points of origin, one on the iliac crest here, and then one from the spine. Don't worry about that too much. Just know that the iliopsoas are up here in the hip area. And then here's a better look at the adductor group. You can see the deeper one. So we have adductor brevis up here, it's a really short one. Adductor longus is this one here. Adductor magnus, it has several heads that are kind of spread out here. So you have this one here, here, and here. And then the pectineus is going to run across here, but it's cut in this image. And then here we can see the deep muscles of the quad. So again, we have that vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, which you can see before. The rectus femoris has been removed so that we can now see the vastus intermedialis or vastus intermedius running down here in the middle. And then here are the muscles of the hip and the hamstring region. So you have our glute maximus and our gluteus medius here. And then this side has a cadaver image of the same thing. And then within the hamstring, we have our semitendinosus here, our semimembranosus here and here, the bicep femoris here, and at the bottom, you can also start to see the muscle of the lower leg with our gastrocnemius, which is the main calf muscle attached up here in the femur. You can also see, again, that gracilis here and the adductor magnus here. So again, here is another look at the thigh muscles. So adductor magnus here, and then the three hamstring muscles again. We have our semimembranosus here, the semblitendinosus here, and then the bicep femoris here. Now we'll go over the muscle of the lower leg. So we have our tibialis anterior, the extensor digitorum longus, the fibularis longus, the plantaris, the soleus, and the gastrocnemius. So the fibularis longus is going to run along the outside of the leg here. It's a really long muscle, kind of runs back down and attaches down here. We have our extensor digitorum longus, which is going to allow you to extend your toes and help with plantar flexion. Same with the tibialis anterior. That's also going to be a main driver in plantar flexion. Sorry, that's wrong. So again, we have our fibularis longus here, the extensor digitorum longus, and tibialis anterior. Those three muscles are going to help assist in dorsiflexion, so you can bring your toes up. And then again, we have our gastrocnemius here, which is the main superficial calf muscle, which is the one you think of when you think of someone's calf. That's the gastrocnemius. And beneath that, we have the soleus. And then here's just another view of the lower leg. You can really see the big gastrocnemius here on the superficial portion of the posterior leg. And then beneath that, we have our soleus. You can see the long fibularis longus coming down from the knee all the way down to the ankle. And we can see the extensor digitorum longus run down the front of the leg and attached to the phalanges of the feet. And then again, the tibialis anterior here, again, running down the front of the leg and attaching to the metacarpals phalanges of the foot to help with plantar flexion. And then here we can see the gastroc and soleus again. So the gastrocnemius has two heads, the medial and lateral head. And then your tendon of the gastrocnemius, which is also your calcaneal tendon, which is what you know as your Achilles heel. And then beneath that again is the soleus. So for the practice coming up, you will need to know the origin, action, and insertion of the muscles listed on Canvas. I will go over those with you in lab. There are 2 PowerPoints we'll look at in lab tomorrow. So we do that together. An example would be the rectus abdominis inserts onto the what? So more to study. So again, the PowerPoints on muscle origin, insertion, and actions are on Canvas. You will need to know that for Practical 3. You can find them in the Practical 3 area on your modules. And then study the muscle and joint model PowerPoints as well, still in that module region. As far as what is due for you, we have post-lab quiz 5 and 6 due on November 4th. We have our physio exercises, activities 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. You have the human muscle drawing and dissection assignment. I'll talk about that in class. And we have the body viz assignments. Remember that body viz, you must do the assessment modules for a grade. Okay, that's it. I'll see you guys in the lab. We'll talk about some stuff some more.